When I asked about the grand opening of my son Aaron's boutique dermatology clinic, the one I had personally bankrolled with $900,000 of my hard-earned retirement funds, his wife Melissa let out a soft, condescending sigh. She told me the opening was 6 weeks ago. She said they only invited close family and friends because it was an exclusive networking vibe. I did not scream. I did not demand my money back. I simply hung up the phone. A few days later, she called me in an absolute panic because the medical supplier bills were overdue, and she demanded to know if I had sent the next phase of operating funds. I smiled, staring at the commercial foreclosure documents on my heavy oak desk, and told her I thought she only discussed finances with close family. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful relative a lesson they will never forget. My name is Warren Gallagher. I am 66 years old, and my hands still carry the rough calluses of a man who spent 40 years pulling himself up from the absolute bottom. I built a massive commercial real estate portfolio in the harsh, freezing winters of Chicago, pouring concrete and negotiating ruthless land deals. I did not inherit a single dime from anyone. Everything I own was built on 70-hour work weeks and an iron will. When my beautiful wife passed away 4 years ago, the silence in our large home became completely deafening. I thought I could fill that agonizing void by pouring my life, my resources, and my undivided attention into our only son, Aaron. Aaron is a newly licensed dermatologist. He is a boy who was born on third base but has spent his entire adult life entirely convinced that he hit a triple. I made sure he never had to work a grueling summer job in the sweltering heat. I made sure his expensive medical school tuition was paid entirely in cash, so he would never know the crushing, suffocating weight of student debt. That was my first and greatest mistake. Comfort breeds a very specific type of weakness and a deep, dangerous entitlement. His wife Melissa is the perfect embodiment of that exact weakness. Melissa appointed herself the clinic administrator the very moment I agreed to fund their medical venture. She has the financial literacy of a spoiled child, but possesses a massive ego that demands constant, uninterrupted luxury. Whenever they visited my home for Sunday dinners, she would look at my faded flannel shirts and my worn leather work boots with barely concealed disgust. She treated me not as a grieving father, but as a blue-collar relic who simply happened to be holding the golden keys to their upper-class lifestyle. I tolerated her endless, subtle insults. I ignored the way Aaron would carelessly check his phone while I tried to offer him business advice. I truly believed my ultimate financial sacrifice would secure his professional future and keep our fractured family together. I made the monumental decision to liquidate a prime commercial asset. I sold a massive, lucrative warehouse complex I had owned for 20 years just to hand them a certified cashier check for $900,000. The money was strictly supposed to cover the architectural build-out, the initial marketing campaign, and the outright purchase of state-of-the-art medical lasers. Because I am a businessman, I drafted a comprehensive 80-page limited liability company formation document to structure the capital as a secured senior loan. I placed the massive stack of papers in front of them, but they were so blinded by the zeros on the check, they signed every signature line without reading a single page. They only cared about the deposit clearing my bank account. For 2 long months, they constantly told me the clinic opening was heavily delayed due to minor permit issues and annoying supply chain problems. One Tuesday afternoon, I decided to take a quiet drive to the upscale medical district to personally check on the progress of the construction. I fully expected to see drywall dust, exposed electrical wires, and exhausted contractors rushing to meet a tight deadline. I parked my old reliable truck down the street from the provided address. I walked toward the building, but I did not see a messy construction zone. I saw a sleek, modern glass facade with a glowing silver sign proudly displaying Aaron's full name. In the reserved premium parking spot closest to the private rear entrance sat a brand-new slate-gray Porsche Panamera. The shiny license plate was customized with Melissa's initials. I walked slowly through the heavy glass front doors, and the cold blast of air conditioning carried the distinct scent of expensive eucalyptus diffusers. The spacious waiting room looked exactly like the lobby of a high-end luxury hotel. The massive reception desk was carved from a single solid block of imported Italian marble. There were plush velvet seating areas and a complimentary champagne bar designed to impress their wealthy clients. A young receptionist wearing a tailored designer uniform looked up from her sleek computer monitor and politely asked if I had a scheduled appointment. I asked her exactly how long the clinic had been open to the public. She smiled brightly and proudly informed me that they had been fully operational for 6 weeks. 6 entire weeks. I walked right past her, completely ignoring her sudden protests, and moved down the pristine white hallway toward the private procedure rooms. I looked inside an empty, brightly lit treatment room. There was a massive high-tech medical laser machine sitting quietly in the corner. I stepped closer and checked the metal back panel. There was a strict asset tag securely bolted to the plastic casing. It was a standard lease tag from a third-party corporate medical supply company. I quickly checked the next room and found the exact same terrifying reality. The expensive surgical chairs, the advanced sterilization equipment, the high-definition imaging monitors, absolutely everything was leased. My seasoned mind instantly went to work calculating the horrific financial reality of what I was looking at. $900,000 was more than enough capital to buy the entire facility of equipment outright and comfortably cover a full year of operating costs. But they did not buy the equipment. They leased every single item to preserve the initial cash injection. They deliberately used my retirement funds to buy a luxury sports car, to import Italian marble, to fund a ridiculous champagne bar, and to pay themselves exorbitant unearned salaries before a single paying patient had even walked through the front door. They had taken my entire life's work and turned it into a shallow, theatrical performance of wealth. I turned around and walked out the back door without saying a single word to anyone. The cold, dark realization settled deep into my aging bones. I drove back to my empty house in absolute dead silence. I did not turn on the radio. I walked straight into my private home office and sat down at the large wooden desk where I had aggressively negotiated multi-million-dollar development contracts with the most ruthless men in the city. I picked up my phone and dialed Aaron's personal number. He did not answer the call. The line automatically rolled over to the clinic administrative desk, and Melissa picked up the receiver. Her voice was bright and painfully artificial as she recited the fancy name of the dermatology practice. I did not greet her. I simply asked Aaron's wife about the grand opening of the clinic I had built for them. I asked why I was not there to see the ribbon cut and celebrate my son. I clearly heard the sharp hesitation in her breath before her natural arrogance returned to mask her guilt. She let out that soft, condescending sigh I had come to deeply despise. "Oh, the grand opening was 6 weeks ago, Warren," she said, her tone dripping with a highly practiced false apology. "We only invited close family and friends. You understand, it was an exclusive networking vibe for the local elite." The heavy words hung in the stagnant air of my office. Close family and friends. The man who had sold a massive piece of his soul to buy their fake reality was not considered close family. I was just the silent bank, and the bank is never invited to the celebration party. In that tiny fraction of a second, the lingering grief of a father, desperately hoping for his son's love, completely evaporated. The paternal warmth left my body replaced instantly by a familiar icy clarity I had not felt since my ruthless days tearing down terrible commercial investments. I did not scream at her through the phone. I did not list the endless sacrifices I had made for my son. I did not demand my $900,000 back. I simply hung up the phone. I placed the device down on the polished wood and folded my calloused hands. Aaron and Melissa truly believed they had easily outsmarted an irrelevant old man. They believed they could bleed my accounts dry and cast me aside into the shadows because they foolishly confused my quiet paternal patience with pathetic weakness. They had completely forgotten who they were dealing with. The sad, grieving father in me died right there in that leather chair, but the ruthless businessman who built an empire from wet concrete and cold steel woke up. I slowly opened my bottom desk drawer and pulled out the thick 80-page contract they had been too arrogant and greedy to read. It was time to show my son and his wife exactly what happens when you decide to steal from a man who knows how to legally write the rules of destruction. When I asked about the grand opening of my son Aaron's boutique dermatology clinic, the one I had personally bankrolled with $900,000 of my hard-earned retirement funds, his wife Melissa let out a soft, condescending sigh. She told me the opening was 6 weeks ago. She said they only invited close family and friends because it was an exclusive networking vibe. I did not scream. I did not demand my money back. I simply hung up the phone. A few days later, she called me in an absolute panic because the medical supplier bills were overdue, and she demanded to know if I had sent the next phase of operating funds. I smiled, staring at the commercial foreclosure documents on my heavy oak desk, and told her I thought she only discussed finances with close family. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful relative a lesson they will never forget. My name is Warren Gallagher. I am 66 years old, and my hands still carry the rough calluses of a man who spent 40 years pulling himself up from the absolute bottom. I built a massive commercial real estate portfolio in the harsh, freezing winters of Chicago, pouring concrete and negotiating ruthless land deals. I did not inherit a single dime from anyone. Everything I own was built on 70-hour work weeks and an iron will. When my beautiful wife passed away 4 years ago, the silence in our large home became completely deafening. I thought I could fill that agonizing void by pouring my life, my resources, and my undivided attention into our only son, Aaron. Aaron is a newly licensed dermatologist. He is a boy who was born on third base, but has spent his entire adult life entirely convinced that he hit a triple. I made sure he never had to work a grueling summer job in the sweltering heat. I made sure his expensive medical school tuition was paid entirely in cash, so he would never know the crushing, suffocating weight of student debt. That was my first and greatest mistake. Comfort breeds a very specific type of weakness and a deep, dangerous entitlement. His wife, Melissa, is the perfect embodiment of that exact weakness. Melissa appointed herself the clinic administrator the very moment I agreed to fund their medical venture. She has the financial literacy of a spoiled child, but possesses a massive ego that demands constant, uninterrupted luxury. Whenever they visited my home for Sunday dinners, she would look at my faded flannel shirts and my worn leather work boots with barely concealed disgust. She treated me not as a grieving father, but as a blue-collar relic who simply happened to be holding the golden keys to their upper-class lifestyle. I tolerated her endless, subtle insults. I ignored the way Aaron would carelessly check his phone while I tried to offer him business advice. I truly believed my ultimate financial sacrifice would secure his professional future and keep our fractured family together. I made the monumental decision to liquidate a prime commercial asset. I sold a massive, lucrative warehouse complex I had owned for 20 years just to hand them a certified cashier check for $900,000. The money was strictly supposed to cover the architectural build out, the initial marketing campaign, and the outright purchase of state-of-the-art medical lasers. Because I am a businessman, I drafted a comprehensive 80-page limited liability company formation document to structure the capital as a secured senior loan. I placed the massive stack of papers in front of them, but they were so blinded by the zeros on the check, they signed every signature line without reading a single page. They only cared about the deposit clearing my bank account. For 2 long months, they constantly told me the clinic opening was heavily delayed due to minor permit issues and annoying supply chain problems. One Tuesday afternoon, I decided to take a quiet drive to the upscale medical district to personally check on the progress of the construction. I fully expected to see drywall dust, exposed electrical wires, and exhausted contractors rushing to meet a tight deadline. I parked my old reliable truck down the street from the provided address. I walked toward the building, but I did not see a messy construction zone. I saw a sleek, modern glass facade with a glowing silver sign proudly displaying Aaron's full name. In the reserved premium parking spot, closest to the private rear entrance, sat a brand-new slate-gray Porsche Panamera. The shiny license plate was customized with Melissa's initials. I walked slowly through the heavy glass front doors, and the cold blast of air conditioning carried the distinct scent of expensive eucalyptus diffusers. The spacious waiting room looked exactly like the lobby of a high-end luxury hotel. The massive reception desk was carved from a single solid block of imported Italian marble. There were plush velvet seating areas and a complimentary champagne bar designed to impress their wealthy clients. A young receptionist wearing a tailored designer uniform looked up from her sleek computer monitor and politely asked if I had a scheduled appointment. I asked her exactly how long the clinic had been open to the public. She smiled brightly and proudly informed me that they had been fully operational for 6 weeks. 6 entire weeks. I walked right past her, completely ignoring her sudden protests, and moved down the pristine white hallway toward the private procedure rooms. I looked inside an empty, brightly lit treatment room. There was a massive high-tech medical laser machine sitting quietly in the corner. I stepped closer and checked the metal back panel. There was a strict asset tag securely bolted to the plastic casing. It was a standard lease tag from a third-party corporate medical supply company. I quickly checked the next room and found the exact same terrifying reality. The expensive surgical chairs, the advanced sterilization equipment, the high-definition imaging monitors, absolutely everything was leased. My seasoned mind instantly went to work calculating the horrific financial reality of what I was looking at. $900,000 was more than enough capital to buy the entire facility of equipment outright and comfortably cover a full year of operating costs. But they did not buy the equipment. They leased every single item to preserve the initial cash injection. They deliberately used my retirement funds to buy a luxury sports car, to import Italian marble to fund a ridiculous champagne bar, and to pay themselves exorbitant unearned salaries before a single paying patient had even walked through the front door. They had taken my entire life's work and turned it into a shallow, theatrical performance of wealth. I turned around and walked out the back door without saying a single word to anyone. The cold, dark realization settled deep into my aging bones. I drove back to my empty house in absolute dead silence. I did not turn on the radio. I walked straight into my private home office and sat down at the large wooden desk where I had aggressively negotiated multi-million-dollar development contracts with the most ruthless men in the city. I picked up my phone and dialed Aaron's personal number. He did not answer the call. The line automatically rolled over to the clinic administrative desk, and Melissa picked up the receiver. Her voice was bright and painfully artificial as she recited the fancy name of the dermatology practice. I did not greet her. I simply asked Aaron's wife about the grand opening of the clinic I had built for them. I asked why I was not there to see the ribbon cut and celebrate my son. I clearly heard the sharp hesitation in her breath before her natural arrogance returned to mask her guilt. She let out that soft, condescending sigh I had come to deeply despise. "Oh, the grand opening was 6 weeks ago, Warren," she said, her tone dripping with a highly practiced false apology. "We only invited close family and friends, you understand. It was an exclusive networking vibe for the local elite." The heavy words hung in the stagnant air of my office. Close family and friends. The man who had sold a massive piece of his soul to buy their fake reality was not considered close family. I was just the silent bank, and the bank is never invited to the celebration party. In that tiny fraction of a second, the lingering grief of a father desperately hoping for his son's love, completely evaporated. The paternal warmth left my body, replaced instantly by a familiar, icy clarity I had not felt since my ruthless days tearing down terrible commercial investments. I did not scream at her through the phone. I did not list the endless sacrifices I had made for my son. I did not demand my $900,000 back. I simply hung up the phone. I placed the device down on the polished wood and folded my calloused hands. Aaron and Melissa truly believed they had easily outsmarted an irrelevant old man. They believed they could bleed my accounts dry and cast me aside into the shadows because they foolishly confused my quiet paternal patience with pathetic weakness. They had completely forgotten who they were dealing with. The sad, grieving father in me died right there in that leather chair, but the ruthless businessman who built an empire from wet concrete and cold steel woke up. I slowly opened my bottom desk drawer and pulled out the thick 80-page contract they had been too arrogant and greedy to read. It was time to show my son and his wife exactly what happens when you decide to steal from a man who knows how to legally write the rules of destruction. I did not call my son back. I did not drive to their luxury townhouse to demand an explanation or yell until my throat was raw. Anger is a useless emotion that only alerts your enemies to your next move. I simply picked up the thick manila envelope containing the original 80-page limited liability company operating agreement, walked out of my quiet house, and climbed into the driver's seat of my old pickup truck. The engine roared to life with a heavy mechanical growl that felt perfectly aligned with the cold, hard rhythm currently beating inside my chest. I backed out of the driveway and pointed my truck toward the downtown financial district. My destination was the law office of Simon Foster. Simon is a ruthless corporate attorney who has successfully navigated every single legal war I have ever waged over the past 30 years. As I drove down the crowded interstate, my mind drifted back to the horrific financial crash of 2008. It was a brutal, agonizing time that completely wiped out half the commercial real estate developers in Chicago. I watched proud, wealthy men lose their massive homes, their luxury cars, and their entire life savings in a matter of weeks. I watched lifelong friendships shatter into dust over unpaid debts and broken promises. I watched men I deeply respected jump out of windows because they had trusted handshakes and gentleman agreements instead of relying on ironclad legal documentation. I survived that terrifying economic slaughter for one very specific reason. I never trusted anyone when it came to large sums of money. I protected my assets with complex, unforgiving contracts that left absolutely zero room for interpretation. I learned the hard way that when money is involved, blood relations and friendly smiles mean absolutely nothing. That brutal lesson is exactly why I did not simply write a check for $900,000 and hand it over to my son. When Aaron and Melissa originally presented their business plan, they treated the massive capital request like a casual family favor. They brought over a bottle of expensive wine and confidently asked me to fund their dream, as if they were asking me to cover the dinner bill. I agreed to provide the capital, but I forced them to sit down at my dining room table with Simon Foster present to formally structure the investment. I remember that evening vividly. Melissa was visibly annoyed by the massive stack of legal documents placed in front of her. She rolled her eyes and complained that families should not need so much tedious paperwork. Aaron laughed nervously and joked that his old man was just being overly dramatic about his retirement funds. They were so incredibly eager to get their hands on the cash that they flipped straight to the back page and signed their names on the dotted lines without reading a single word of the preceding 79 pages. They had absolutely no idea what they had just signed. They did not realize that the 80-page document was a legally binding senior secured loan agreement, heavily disguised as a standard operating charter. They did not know that by signing that document, they had granted me a comprehensive senior lien on absolutely every single asset the clinic would ever own. Every dollar that flowed through their business accounts, every piece of medical equipment, Every patient receivable and every single chair in that luxurious waiting room technically belonged to me until the loan was entirely repaid with interest. I pulled my truck into the underground parking garage of Simon Foster's high-rise office building. I walked into the sleek, modern lobby and took the elevator up to the 40th floor. The receptionist recognized me immediately and guided me straight into Simon's massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. Simon was sitting behind his pristine glass desk, reviewing a complicated merger file. He is a tall, sharp man who speaks entirely in facts and calculates every possible legal outcome before he even opens his mouth. He looked up from his paperwork, saw the completely dead expression in my eyes, and immediately recognized the heavy manila envelope in my hand. He knew instantly that the grieving, hopeful father was gone and the ruthless commercial developer had returned. Simon stood up, closed his office door, and asked me exactly what had happened. I did not waste any time with emotional complaints or dramatic tears. I placed the thick contract on his glass desk and told him that the boutique dermatology clinic had been fully operational for 6 entire weeks. I told him that I was completely excluded from the grand opening and that my daughter-in-law was currently panicking because she could not pay the medical supply vendors. Then I told him the most important fact of all. I told him that every single piece of advanced medical equipment in that expensive facility was leased from a third-party corporate vendor. Simon slowly opened the manila envelope and pulled out the signed operating agreement. He adjusted his glasses and flipped directly to Section 4, Paragraph B. He read the clause aloud in the quiet room. The clause explicitly stated that the $900,000 capital injection was strictly restricted funds. The money was legally mandated to be used for the outright purchase of medical assets to properly secure the collateral of the senior loan. By choosing to lease the medical equipment and divert my restricted capital to purchase a luxury sports car, Italian marble, and exorbitant personal salaries, Aaron and Melissa had committed a massive material breach of the core financial covenant. They had not just disrespected me as a father. They had legally defrauded a secured creditor. Simon looked up from the contract and asked me how I wanted to proceed. He offered to draft a formal warning letter demanding immediate compliance and a full accounting of the remaining funds. He suggested that we could freeze their operational bank accounts immediately to stop the financial bleeding. I shook my head and completely rejected both of his logical suggestions. Sending a warning letter would give them precious time to hide the remaining money or attempt to secure a fraudulent bridge loan to cover their tracks. Freezing the accounts today would simply alert them to the fact that I knew exactly what they were doing. I did not want to warn them. I wanted to build an inescapable financial cage completely around them while they were still happily distracted by their own toxic arrogance. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against a greedy person, because a greedy person will always interpret your silence as stupid compliance. I instructed Simon to keep his actions completely invisible. I ordered him to initiate a quiet forensic audit of their corporate accounts, utilizing the absolute legal authority granted to me in Section 9 of the operating agreement. I wanted to know exactly where every single penny of my $900,000 had gone. I wanted to see the hidden consulting fees. I wanted to see the luxury car payments, and I wanted the exact names of the medical supply vendors they were currently failing to pay. Simon nodded slowly, fully understanding the devastating strategy I was setting into motion. He warned me that initiating this quiet legal process meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He reminded me that once we weaponized the contract against my own son, there would be absolutely no going back to Sunday family dinners or polite holiday gatherings. I looked out the large glass window at the sprawling city below us. I thought about the pale pink dress my late wife would have worn to the clinic grand opening if she were still alive. I thought about the condescending tone in Melissa's voice when she told me I was not invited. The line had already been crossed weeks ago. I was simply preparing the absolute destruction of the people standing on the other side. I told Simon to execute the audit immediately and to contact me the very second he found the unpaid vendor invoices. I turned around and walked out of his beautiful office feeling lighter and stronger than I had in 4 years. The painful emotional burden of trying to buy my son's love was finally gone forever. It was replaced by the clean, pure geometry of a perfectly executed legal contract. Aaron and Melissa thought they had successfully stolen my retirement to fund their glamorous fake lives. They were about to discover that they had simply financed their own absolute ruin. The forensic audit began in absolute secrecy the very next morning. Simon did not hire a standard accountant to look over the books. He brought in a former federal financial investigator, a man who specialized in dismantling complex corporate fraud and tracking hidden assets. Because the 80-page operating agreement granted me total unilateral authority as the senior secured creditor, Simon was able to quietly serve a strict legal notice directly to the primary commercial bank holding the clinic accounts. The bank was legally obligated to comply with the senior lien holder, and they immediately handed over every single transaction record, wire transfer, and credit card statement associated with the dermatology practice. Aaron and Melissa were entirely blind to this massive financial intrusion. They were too busy posing for photographs in their expensive leased lobby to realize that the silent old man they had discarded was currently mapping out the exact blueprint of their financial destruction. 3 days later, Simon called my personal cell phone and calmly asked me to return to his office. He told me the investigator had finished compiling the data and that I needed to see the results in person. The weather outside was bitterly cold, and a heavy gray rain washed over the city as I drove back downtown. The dismal atmosphere perfectly matched the absolute lack of emotion inside my heart. I walked into Simon's corner office and saw a massive thick binder sitting perfectly centered on his glass desk. The investigator had categorized every single penny of my $900,000 investment. I sat down in the leather chair, and Simon opened the binder. He did not offer me any comforting words or sympathetic apologies. He knew I only cared about the hard, undeniable facts. Simon started by explaining my son's behavior. He turned to the section outlining the daily patient logs and the incoming revenue streams. Aaron was working non-stop. The clinic was fully booked from early morning until late in the evening. But the financial numbers simply did not make any sense. Despite the massive influx of patients, the actual gross revenue was horrifyingly low. Simon pointed to the billing records and explained exactly what my son was doing. Aaron was desperately trying to build an elite reputation among the city socialites, local celebrities, and wealthy internet influencers. Instead of running a profitable medical business, he was using the clinic as a vanity project to boost his own social status. He was handing out massive discounts and providing tens of thousands of dollars in free cosmetic treatments to these wealthy individuals just so they would invite him to their exclusive parties and mention his name online. He was completely ignoring the accounting software and refusing to look at the daily financial reports. He simply walked into his beautiful leased clinic every single day, put on his custom-tailored white coat, and played the role of a highly successful medical visionary while his business was secretly bleeding to death. Aaron's foolish vanity was incredibly disappointing, but it was nothing compared to the calculated predatory greed of his wife. Simon slowly turned the page to the clinic operating budget, and the atmosphere in the room turned ice cold. Melissa was not just a terrible clinic administrator. She was actively and systematically embezzling my retirement funds. Simon pointed his pen at a long column of massive recurring wire transfers leaving the clinic bank account every single week. These transfers were not going to medical suppliers or utility companies. They were being sent directly to an external corporate entity called Apex Lifestyle Management. Simon had the investigator dig into the state registry to find the formation documents for this mysterious vendor. The results were absolutely sickening. Apex Lifestyle Management was a shadow limited liability company registered just 2 months ago under Melissa's maiden name. She was the sole managing member and the only authorized signatory on the receiving bank account. She was billing her husband's medical practice over $40,000 a month for completely fabricated services. The invoice descriptions were utterly ridiculous. She was charging the clinic exorbitant fees for things like brand synergy consulting, elite demographic marketing, and atmospheric curation. It was nothing but a complex money laundering scheme. She was using her position as the clinic administrator to approve these massive fake invoices and then wiring the secured loan capital straight into her own personal bank account. Simon laid out the personal bank statements the investigator had legally acquired through the financial tracing protocols. I sat there in total silence and looked at exactly how my daughter-in-law was spending the money I had earned, pouring concrete in the freezing rain. I saw the massive down payment for the slate gray Porsche. I saw weekly transactions for thousands of dollars at high-end designer clothing boutiques. I saw charges for lavish weekend spa retreats and expensive imported jewelry. She was burning through my money with a terrifying, reckless speed, completely convinced that the endless supply of cash would never dry up. She truly believed she had found the perfect victim in her quiet, elderly father-in-law. I looked up from the documents and asked Simon what this meant for the actual operational stability of the clinic. Simon turned to the final tab in the binder and showed me the tragic consequence of Melissa's relentless theft. Because she was aggressively draining the primary operating cash to fund her fake consulting firm and maintain her luxury lifestyle, there was absolutely no money left over to pay the legitimate business expenses. The forensic investigator had flagged over 24 past due notices from the primary medical supply vendors. These were the critical companies that provided the sterile bandages, the surgical syringes, and the expensive proprietary chemicals required to operate the leased medical lasers. Melissa was completely ignoring these vendor invoices to ensure her own fraudulent consulting fees were paid first. She was starving the actual medical practice to feed her boundless vanity. Simon explained that the clinic was currently functioning on borrowed time. The vendors were already sending final warning notices. Within a few short weeks, they would completely cut off the supply chain and freeze the clinic accounts. Without those essential medical supplies, Aaron would be physically unable to perform his cosmetic procedures. He would be forced to cancel his high-profile appointments, and the fragile, wealthy reputation he was so desperately trying to build would completely collapse overnight. Simon leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He told me that we had enough concrete evidence to instantly freeze the clinic accounts, contact the authorities, and have Melissa arrested for severe financial fraud and embezzlement. He explained that her actions violated multiple state and federal laws regarding the misappropriation of secured corporate funds. He was entirely ready to draft the legal complaints and completely destroy her world before the sun went down. I stared down at the binder and slowly closed the cover. I shook my head and told Simon to hold the paperwork. Arresting Melissa right now would be far too easy, and it would completely ruin the lesson I needed to teach them. If I shut them down today, Aaron would simply play the role of the innocent victim. He would claim he had absolutely no idea his wife was stealing, and he would beg me for forgiveness and another financial bailout. I refused to let him escape his own willful ignorance. He chose to marry a parasite, and he chose to ignore his business in favor of playing a wealthy socialite. They needed to feel the absolute crushing weight of the trap they had built for themselves. I instructed Simon to leave the accounts completely open and let Melissa continue her fraudulent wire transfers. I wanted her to feel incredibly safe and untouchable. I wanted Aaron to continue handing out free treatments while the walls silently closed in around him. But I also knew I needed to completely control the inevitable fallout when the money finally ran out. I looked at the list of unpaid medical supply vendors, and a new strategy formed in my mind. I told Simon to reach out to the largest medical supply company on that past due list. I told him I wanted to quietly purchase the distressed debt that the clinic currently owed them. Simon smiled a very cold, calculating smile. He instantly understood the sheer brutality of my plan. By secretly purchasing the vendor debt, I would not just be their primary secured investor, I would also become their most critical operational creditor. When Melissa inevitably ran out of stolen money, and the supplies stopped coming, she would be forced to desperately beg the vendor for an extension. She would have absolutely no idea that the person holding the very lifeblood of her clinic was the exact same blue-collar relic she had refused to invite to her grand opening. I stood up from the glass desk and thanked Simon for his excellent work. I walked out of the office and rode the elevator down to the busy city street. The gray rain was still falling, but I did not feel the cold. I felt a deep, powerful sense of absolute control. My son and his wife had stolen my money to build a beautiful glass castle, but they had completely failed to realize that I was the one secretly holding the hammer. I sat in the quiet solitude of my home office the next morning, watching the heavy rain wash over the driveway. The thick forensic accounting binder was locked securely inside my floor safe. I knew exactly how much money Melissa was stealing every single week. I knew exactly how my son was playing dress-up in a leased clinic. A weaker man would have driven over there immediately, kicking down the beautiful glass doors and screaming until his lungs gave out. A weaker man would have called the police right then and there to drag his daughter-in-law out in handcuffs. But I did not want a quick emotional explosion. I wanted a total structural collapse. If I froze their bank accounts right now, Aaron would undoubtedly play the role of the innocent, confused victim. He would look at me with those practiced, sorrowful eyes and swear he had absolutely no idea his wife was a criminal. He would beg for another financial bailout to save his precious reputation. I refused to give him that convenient escape route. He chose to marry a parasite, and he chose to completely ignore the financial reality of his own business just so he could rub elbows with the city elite. He needed to feel the absolute crushing weight of the trap they had built together. I decided to let Melissa continue her fraudulent wire transfers. I wanted her to feel incredibly safe and completely untouchable. I wanted the clinic to keep running on fumes until the engine finally tore itself apart. I picked up the phone and called Simon. I told him to hold all the legal complaints and criminal referrals. Instead, I directed his attention back to the forensic audit, specifically to the long list of unpaid medical supply vendors. I asked him to identify the single most critical supplier on that list. I wanted the company that provided the exact proprietary chemicals, the specialized surgical lasers, and the sterile equipment Aaron absolutely needed to perform his expensive cosmetic procedures. Simon pulled up the file and immediately identified a regional medical distribution company called Horizon Clinical Logistics. Horizon was the primary vendor keeping Aaron in business. According to the audit, Melissa had completely ignored their invoices for 2 straight months. The clinic currently owed Horizon over $80,000 in past due payments. Simon noted that Horizon had already issued 2 formal warning letters and was preparing to completely sever the supply chain by the end of the week. I told Simon to contact the chief financial officer of Horizon Clinical Logistics immediately. I instructed him to arrange a private meeting and negotiate the outright purchase of my son's corporate debt. Simon paused for a moment on the phone, completely absorbing the sheer brutality of my strategy. Buying distressed commercial debt is a very common practice in the cutthroat world of real estate, but applying it to your own flesh and blood was a uniquely cold maneuver. By legally purchasing the $80,000 in past due invoices from Horizon, I would completely take over their position. I would legally become the vendor. The execution was remarkably simple and brutally effective. 2 days later, I sat in Simon's office while he finalized the legal assignment of debt with the executives from Horizon. They were more than happy to offload the toxic clinic account without having to hire an expensive collection agency. I wrote them a certified cashier check for the full $80,000 out of my personal savings. In exchange, they signed over every single legal right collection authority and active supply contract associated with Aaron's dermatology practice. They formally transferred the vendor account entirely into a private holding company that I completely controlled. Aaron and Melissa were entirely blind to this massive, invisible shift in power. They had absolutely no idea that the massive faceless medical supply corporation they had been ignoring was now completely owned and operated by the elderly father they had so easily discarded. I was no longer just the silent investor holding a senior lien on their business. I was now the absolute master of their daily operations. I controlled the sterile bandages. I controlled the specialized syringes. I controlled the very chemicals my son needed to maintain his fake wealthy lifestyle. Every single time Aaron scheduled a high-profile patient, he was relying on materials that belonged to me. Every single time Melissa walked past the supply closet, she was looking at inventory that I legally owned. I instructed Simon to have Horizon send one final automated notice to the clinic, officially stating that the account had been sold to a private third-party management firm. Melissa would undoubtedly ignore that standard corporate notice just like she ignored all the others. She would simply throw it in the trash and authorize another massive fraudulent wire transfer to her shadow consulting company, completely unaware that she had just signed her own death warrant. The trap was now perfectly set, and the steel jaws were completely hidden under the dirt. All I had to do was sit back and wait for the inevitable moment when the clinic storeroom finally ran out of supplies. I knew exactly what would happen. Melissa would panic. She would realize she could not order any more materials to keep the clinic open without paying the massive past-due balance. She would desperately try to call the new vendor holding her debt, begging for an emergency delivery, just to keep the lights on and the wealthy patients happy. She would have absolutely no idea that the phone ringing on the other end of that desperate call would be sitting right on my heavy oak desk. I leaned back in my chair and watched the rain slowly stop outside my window. The storm was over for me, but it was just beginning for them. Exactly 11 days after I purchased the commercial debt from the medical supply company, my personal cell phone began to vibrate aggressively on the kitchen counter. I was calmly pouring my morning coffee, watching the morning news. I looked down at the glowing screen and saw Melissa's name flashing urgently. The absolute panic I had mathematically calculated was finally arriving right on schedule. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee before I picked up the receiver. I did not say hello. I simply breathed into the phone and waited for her to speak. Her voice was completely frantic, stripped of the arrogant polish she usually wore like expensive perfume. She did not bother to ask how I was doing or apologize for ignoring me for weeks. She immediately launched into a chaotic story about a massive, catastrophic clerical error at the clinic. She claimed that their primary medical supplier had suddenly and maliciously frozen their purchasing account without any prior warning. She told me that Aaron had 3 wealthy clients scheduled that afternoon for highly specialized laser treatments, and they absolutely did not have the proprietary chemical compounds required to turn the machines on. She explained that one of the clients arriving at 2 o'clock was a massive internet influencer with millions of wealthy followers. If Aaron was forced to turn her away because he did not have the basic supplies to operate his own machines, the influencer would completely destroy his elite reputation online before the sun went down. The fragile fake empire they had built on my stolen money was mere hours away from a highly public, terrifying collapse. I listened to her desperate breathing on the other end of the line. I knew for an absolute fact that the supply company had sent her 3 separate automated warnings before cutting off the supply chain. I knew she had completely ignored every single one of those warnings to prioritize the fraudulent wire transfers to her shadow consulting firm. But I played the role of the ignorant elderly father perfectly. I calmly asked her exactly what she needed from me. Her desperation instantly morphed back into her deeply ingrained entitlement. She aggressively demanded that I immediately release the Phase 2 operational capital. When we originally structured the comprehensive loan agreement, I had built in an optional Phase 2 cash injection of $150,000, strictly reserved for emergency facility expansion. It was entirely at my sole discretion to release those restricted funds. Melissa spoke as if that money already belonged to her. She demanded that I wire the $150,000 into the primary clinic account before noon so she could pay off the ridiculous vendor dispute and get the supplies delivered by a private courier. She actually tried to blame the entire situation on the incompetence of the medical supply company. She swore to me that it was just a temporary cash flow issue caused by delayed insurance payouts. It was a pathetic, desperate lie. The clinic did not even accept standard medical insurance. Aaron only accepted cash or premium credit cards for his vanity cosmetic procedures. She was lying straight to my face, completely unaware that I was the exact person holding the unpaid invoices she was desperately trying to wish away. She paused to catch her breath, and the line fell completely silent. She was waiting for the familiar sound of my compliance. She was waiting for the pathetic, grieving father to instantly cave to her demands and open his wallet to save his golden son from embarrassment. I let the silence stretch for 10 agonizing seconds. I wanted her to feel the heavy, crushing weight of that quiet space. I took another slow sip of my coffee. I looked out the kitchen window at the bright morning sun, and I finally spoke. My voice was entirely devoid of any anger or emotion. It was the cold, flat tone of a man reading a permanent death sentence. I told her no. There was a sharp gasp on the other end of the line. Melissa stammered, completely shocked by the single word. She aggressively raised her voice, asking me what I meant. She reminded me that Aaron was my only son, and that his entire elite reputation was on the line today. She told me that if he had to cancel on these high-profile socialites, his medical practice would be ruined forever. She demanded to know why I was suddenly being so incredibly stubborn and cruel when they were facing a massive business emergency. I smiled, staring at the commercial foreclosure documents still resting on my heavy oak desk. I leaned into the phone and delivered the exact words she had used to humiliate me just a few weeks prior. I told her that I thought she only discussed finances with close family. The absolute silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 4 long years. I could practically hear the gears violently grinding inside her head as she realized her own toxic words were being weaponized directly against her. She tried to backtrack immediately. Her voice dropped into a pathetic, whining apology, claiming that I had completely misunderstood what she meant about the grand opening. She started crying, begging me to please just send the money, and promising that we could sit down and have a nice family dinner this weekend to talk about everything. She was offering me a cheap fake dinner in exchange for $150,000. She was trying to buy her survival with the exact same false affection she had ruthlessly denied me for years. I did not let her finish her pathetic apology. I told her that the Phase 2 funds were permanently canceled due to severe operational mismanagement. I told her that she was the brilliant clinic administrator and she would simply have to figure out how to pay her overdue bills without relying on an irrelevant blue-collar relic. Before she could scream or beg or threaten me, I calmly ended the call. I turned off my cell phone, completely cutting their only lifeline to my bank accounts. The illusion of the endless family financial resource was officially dead. I walked back to my desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair. Melissa and Aaron were now completely isolated. They had no medical supplies, they had no backup capital, and they had absolutely no idea that the monster slowly crushing their business was the very father they had thrown away. The true blind panic was about to begin. I placed my cell phone face down on the heavy oak desk and walked into the kitchen to pour another cup of black coffee. The house was completely silent, but in my mind I could hear the absolute chaos erupting across town at my son's luxury clinic. I did not need a hidden camera to see the disaster unfolding. I had been in the ruthless world of commercial business for 40 years, and I knew exactly how a severely underfunded vanity project collapses when the artificial oxygen is finally cut off. I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and waited for the inevitable digital explosion. At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, the massive internet influencer arrived at the clinic for her highly publicized cosmetic procedure. I knew all about this appointment because Simon had the forensic investigator quietly monitoring the clinic public booking schedule. This specific influencer had 3 million wealthy followers who hung on her every word. Erin had foolishly promised her a $10,000 proprietary laser treatment completely free of charge in exchange for a live video review from his imported Italian marble waiting room. She walked through those heavy glass doors completely expecting the ultimate elite medical experience. Erin was waiting for her in his custom-tailored white coat, completely unaware that his wife had severely bankrupted his supply chain. He confidently led the influencer into the pristine white procedure room and offered her a glass of complimentary champagne. He then walked over to the expensive leased medical laser to initiate the prep sequence. That was the exact moment his fake wealthy reality violently shattered. To operate that specific high-tech machine, Erin absolutely needed a highly specialized cooling chemical compound and a specific set of single-use sterile applicators. Those were the exact proprietary materials provided exclusively by the medical supply company that I now secretly owned. Erin opened the pristine white supply cabinet, expecting to see rows of fully stocked boxes. He found absolutely nothing but empty shelves and a few stray cotton swabs. I can only imagine the cold, sickening drop in his stomach as he frantically searched the other treatment rooms, completely abandoning his wealthy patient in the chair. He quickly realized that the clinic was completely empty of all essential operating materials. The business was totally paralyzed. He was a general standing on a beautiful battlefield without a single bullet in his weapon. He had no choice but to walk back into the procedure room, look at the famous influencer, and perform the most humiliating action of his entire arrogant life. He had to cancel the procedure. He could not tell her the truth. He could not admit that his clinic was completely broke and his wife was ignoring the vendor bills to buy designer shoes. He stumbled through a pathetic fabricated excuse about a sudden mechanical failure with the laser machine and promised to reschedule her with a massive discount. The wealthy influencer did not accept his pathetic apology. She had completely rearranged her busy schedule for this highly promoted treatment, and she viewed his sudden cancellation as a massive personal insult. She did not yell or scream. She simply picked up her designer handbag, walked out into the beautiful lobby, and immediately pulled out her cell phone. She hit the record button and broadcasted her absolute disgust to her 3 million followers. Sitting in my quiet kitchen, I watched the live video appear on my laptop screen. I watched this young, angry woman completely dismantle my son's elite reputation in less than 60 seconds. She called his clinic a disorganized joke. She warned her wealthy followers to avoid Erin at all costs, claiming he was highly unprofessional and completely incapable of delivering on his promises. The video was shared thousands of times before she even reached her car in the parking lot. The wealthy socialites and local celebrities Erin had spent months desperately trying to impress were suddenly watching his professional credibility burn to the absolute ground. While the digital firestorm raged online, a very real physical confrontation was exploding inside the clinic. I knew this because Simon was receiving live updates from the banking alerts we had set up. According to the internal timestamps, Erin stormed directly into the administrative office and aggressively confronted his wife. He demanded to know exactly why the supply cabinets were completely empty and why he had just been forced to humiliate himself in front of the most important client in the city. Melissa was completely cornered. She could not admit that she had been embezzling the operational funds to pay her shadow consulting company. She could not admit that I had completely cut them off and refused to release the Phase 2 capital. Her massive ego simply would not allow her to accept responsibility for the terrifying collapse. So she did what all cornered parasites do. She lied right to his face. She blamed the entire catastrophe on a massive banking error. She swore up and down that the money was perfectly safe and that the medical supply company was just being completely unreasonable over a delayed wire transfer. Erin was far too panicked about his ruined internet reputation to demand the actual financial ledgers. He desperately wanted to believe her lies because the alternative reality was simply too horrifying for his fragile ego to accept. He ordered her to fix the banking issue immediately and rushed back out to the lobby to desperately attempt damage control on his social media accounts. Melissa was left entirely alone in her beautiful office, completely suffocating in her own toxic web of lies. She knew the medical supply company was never going to send another shipment until the $80,000 past due balance was paid in full. She knew she could not extract another single dime from my bank accounts. The stolen money she had routed to her personal accounts was already completely gone spent on luxury cars and expensive vacations. She was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin, and she had less than 24 hours to find a massive pile of cash before Aaron finally realized she was a criminal. Desperation breeds severe stupidity. Melissa realized she could not go to a traditional commercial bank for a standard business loan. Traditional banks required weeks of tedious paperwork, comprehensive background checks, and a deep forensic review of the corporate tax returns. If a real bank looked at the clinic books, they would instantly spot her massive fraudulent wire transfers. She needed a massive amount of cash immediately, and she needed a lender who did not ask any difficult questions. She turned to the dark, predatory underbelly of commercial finance. She contacted a notoriously aggressive alternative lending group located on the other side of the city. These predatory lenders specialize in high-risk emergency bridge loans. They provide massive amounts of immediate cash to desperate failing businesses, but they charge absolutely astronomical interest rates and demand brutal collateral terms. They are the financial equivalent of a loan shark wearing a tailored suit. Simon was actively monitoring the clinic credit inquiries, and he called me the moment Melissa submitted the online loan application. He was almost laughing at the sheer reckless audacity of her plan. She was applying for a $150,000 emergency bridge loan entirely behind her husband's back. She forged Aaron's signature on the digital application to bypass the dual authorization requirement. She was committing aggressive identity theft against her own spouse just to cover up her massive embezzlement scheme. But the most entertaining part of her desperate maneuver was the collateral she offered the predatory lender. To secure the $150,000 loan, the alternative lending group demanded a strict physical guarantee. They needed an asset they could legally seize and liquidate if she failed to make the massive weekly interest payments. Melissa confidently offered them the entire clinic. She listed the expensive imported Italian marble reception desk, the plush velvet waiting room furniture, and every single piece of advanced medical equipment in the procedure rooms as unencumbered corporate collateral. She truly believed that because she was the clinic administrator, she possessed the absolute legal authority to pledge those assets to a third-party lender. She was completely oblivious to the horrific legal trap she was blindly walking into. She had completely forgotten about the thick 80-page operating agreement she and Aaron had foolishly signed at my dining room table months ago. She did not realize that the expensive medical equipment she was offering as collateral was actually leased from the vendor company that I now completely owned. You cannot legally pledge leased equipment as collateral for a private loan. It is a massive federal crime. More importantly, she had absolutely no idea that I held a registered senior secured lien on every single asset inside that building. Every dollar, every chair, and every computer monitor legally belonged to me until my original $900,000 investment was completely repaid. Melissa submitted the fraudulent loan application, feeling a massive wave of false relief. She truly believed she had just outsmarted the system. She thought the predatory bridge loan would instantly deposit the cash into the clinic account, allowing her to pay off the medical vendor restock, the supply closets, and completely hide her embezzlement from Aaron before he ever discovered the truth. She thought she had successfully survived the catastrophe. I sat in my kitchen listening to Simon explain the details of her loan application over the phone. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the absolute nightmare she was about to experience. I told Simon to let the predatory lender process her application. I wanted her to feel the absolute thrill of victory right before I completely shattered her world. The guillotine was perfectly raised, and she had just willingly placed her own head squarely on the chopping block. The sun began to set over the city, casting long, dark shadows across my driveway. I was sitting in my quiet living room when Simon called my cell phone. He sounded incredibly satisfied, and his voice carried the sharp, precise tone of a man who had just watched a complex legal strategy execute flawlessly. He told me that the steel trap we built had officially snapped shut. He explained that in the ruthless world of high-risk commercial finance, alternative lenders move with terrifying speed and absolute precision. When Melissa desperately submitted her fraudulent application for the $150,000 emergency bridge loan, she completely underestimated the aggressive due diligence of the people she was trying to manipulate. Predatory lenders do not care about your expensive clothes or your elite social status. They do not care about your fake internet reputation. They only care about cold, hard, registered collateral. Before they wire a single dollar into a business account, they run a comprehensive universal commercial code search on the borrowing entity. They instantly check the state financial registry to see exactly who owns the assets of the company. Simon told me that the lead underwriter for the alternative lending group had actually called his law firm less than an hour ago. The underwriter called because Simon was legally listed as the registered legal agent for the senior lien holder on Aaron's dermatology practice. The underwriter wanted to know if my private holding company would be willing to formally subordinate our massive lien to allow Melissa to secure her new emergency loan. Simon obviously told the underwriter absolutely not. He refused to subordinate our position by a single inch. But Simon did not stop there. He politely informed the underwriter that the expensive medical laser equipment Melissa explicitly offered as physical collateral on her loan application was actually leased property. He explained that the clinic did not own a single piece of the surgical machinery she was trying to pledge. The underwriter was absolutely furious. Predatory alternative lenders despise when desperate borrowers try to aggressively scam them. Attempting to secure a massive commercial loan by pledging leased property that you do not legally own is a severe form of federal wire fraud. The underwriter immediately hung up the phone with Simon and called Melissa directly. Simon had a close professional contact at the lending firm who relayed the exact brutal details of that devastating phone call. I sat in my comfortable living chair and listened as Simon painted the beautiful picture of my daughter-in-law completely unraveling inside her pristine fake office. Melissa was sitting at her imported Italian marble desk, nervously checking her email every 5 seconds. She was desperately waiting for the final loan approval document so she could instantly wire the money to the medical supply company and hide her massive embezzlement from her husband. When her phone rang, she snatched it up immediately, completely expecting the lender to politely tell her that the $150,000 had been successfully deposited. Instead, she was greeted by the cold, aggressive voice of the senior loan underwriter. The underwriter did not bother with professional pleasantries. He aggressively asked her exactly who she thought she was dealing with. Melissa was instantly confused, and her natural arrogance flared up. She defensively told the underwriter that she was the primary administrator of a highly successful elite medical practice, and she demanded to know why the funds had not been released yet. The underwriter laughed a harsh, bitter laugh. He told her that her loan application was officially denied and permanently flagged in their commercial system for severe suspected fraud. Melissa gasped and demanded an immediate explanation. She started yelling about her pristine credit score and the massive daily revenue of the clinic. The underwriter quickly cut her off and delivered the ultimate killing blow. He told her that her credit score was completely irrelevant because she did not actually own a single valuable asset inside her entire building. He explained that his legal team had just pulled the state commercial registry files. He told her that there was a massive senior secured lien currently active on absolutely every single asset associated with the medical practice. Melissa was completely ignorant regarding complex commercial finance. She angrily asked him what a senior lien meant. She truly believed that because her name was on the building lease, she possessed total ownership of the business. The underwriter was more than happy to educate her. He read the exact legal terms of the 80-page operating agreement she had foolishly signed at my dining room table months ago. He told her that the senior lien meant a primary investor held absolute total ownership over everything the clinic possessed until a $900,000 debt was completely repaid with interest. He aggressively listed the exact assets covered under the ironclad contract. He told her the lien completely covered the expensive Italian marble desk she was currently sitting behind. It covered the plush velvet furniture in her beautiful waiting room. It covered every single computer monitor and every piece of office technology. He kept reading down the comprehensive legal list, and the reality of her nightmare grew darker with every single word. The lien covered the entire intellectual property of the business. That meant the actual registered name of the dermatology clinic did not belong to her. The massive digital database containing the names, phone numbers, and private emails of every single wealthy socialite Erin had ever treated did not belong to her. Even the future projected receivables, meaning every single dollar any patient ever paid them for a procedure, was legally pledged to the senior lien holder. Then the underwriter addressed the medical equipment. He aggressively scolded her for attempting to pledge the high-tech surgical lasers as loan collateral. He told her his legal team had already spoken with the primary vendor holding the equipment lease. He informed her that pledging leased corporate assets was a massive federal crime, and he was legally obligated to report her fraudulent loan application to the National Commercial Fraud Registry. He told her that no reputable or alternative bank in the country would ever lend her a single dime again. Melissa was completely paralyzed. The heavy phone trembled in her manicured hand. Her entire arrogant reality was violently crashing down around her. She had spent months treating me like a pathetic, irrelevant old fool. She had mocked my worn clothes and laughed at my quiet demeanor. She truly believed she had easily stolen my entire life savings to build her luxurious empire. Now a stranger on the phone was aggressively explaining that she was nothing but a temporary, uninvited guest sitting inside a financial fortress that I had masterfully built around her. Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. She asked the underwriter exactly who held this massive senior lien. She asked who legally owned the medical supply company that held the laser leases. She was desperately praying that it was some massive faceless banking conglomerate she could somehow beg or negotiate with. The underwriter clearly read the registered name off the state document. He told her the senior lien holder and the absolute owner of her entire operation was a private commercial holding company entirely controlled by a man named Warren Gallagher. The underwriter hung up the phone, leaving Melissa completely alone in the deafening silence of her beautiful office. Simon told me that according to the receptionist who later gossiped about the event, Melissa actually dropped the phone onto the floor and physically collapsed into her chair. She looked around the pristine, luxurious room and suddenly realized the absolute terrifying truth. Every single thing she looked at belonged to me. The walls belonged to me. The art belonged to me. The expensive eucalyptus diffusers belonged to me. Even the sterile bandages and the specialized chemical compounds she needed to run the business belonged entirely to me. She had absolutely nothing. The massive shadow consulting company she had created to embezzle my money was completely useless because there was no more money left to steal. The luxury sports car sitting in the reserved parking spot was completely irrelevant because she could not afford the massive monthly payments without her fraudulent salary. She was completely trapped inside a beautiful glass cage, and I was the one holding the only key. She realized that every single arrogant decision she had made over the past 6 months had simply tightened the noose around her own neck. When she refused to invite me to the grand opening, she sealed her fate. When she called me demanding the Phase 2 operating capital while treating me like an automated teller machine, she guaranteed her own destruction. She finally understood that my quiet patience was not weakness. It was the calculated silence of a seasoned predator perfectly measuring the distance before the final lethal strike. She could not call me to beg for forgiveness, because she knew I had already cut her off entirely. She could not fix the massive supply chain issue because the vendor she owed $80,000 to was actually me. She had nowhere left to run and nobody left to manipulate. The brick wall she hit was made of solid concrete and ironclad legal contracts. The most terrifying part of her realization was that she now had to face her husband. Aaron was currently out in the lobby, desperately trying to salvage his ruined internet reputation after canceling the procedure on the wealthy influencer. He still believed the massive catastrophe was simply a banking error. He still believed his beautiful wife was a brilliant clinic administrator. Melissa knew she had to walk out of her office and look him straight in the eyes. She had to tell him that they were completely bankrupt. She had to confess that she had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars to fund her own vanity. She had to admit that his entire medical practice, his patient list, and his professional future now legally belonged to the father they had both treated like absolute garbage. If she lied to him again, the alternative lender was going to report her to the fraud registry, and she would face federal criminal charges. The absolute unified front of their shared greed was officially fractured. The stress of the financial trap was about to turn the two thieves completely against each other. I thanked Simon for his excellent work and ended the call. I set my phone down on the coffee table and leaned back in my chair. The sun had completely set, leaving the living room, bathed in the quiet, peaceful glow of the streetlights outside. For the first time since my wife passed away, I felt a genuine sense of deep, profound calm. The painful, agonizing hope that my son would eventually learn to respect me was completely gone. It was replaced by the clean, undeniable satisfaction of absolute justice. I did not need to scream or cry or throw things to prove my point. I simply used the brutal mechanical reality of the world to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The first phase of the collapse was completely finished. The illusion of their wealth was shattered, and the heavy chains of consequence were securely wrapped around their throats. Now all I had to do was wait for the morning to arrive. I knew exactly what would happen when the sun came up. They would come to my house. They would come desperately crawling back to the man they had discarded, completely unaware that the guillotine was already perfectly positioned over their heads. I stood up, walked into the kitchen, and began to prepare my dinner. I had a very busy day scheduled for tomorrow, and I needed to be perfectly rested for the final absolute dismantling of their fake empire. The sun had barely risen above the tree line the next morning when the chaotic sound of tires violently tearing up my gravel driveway broke the peaceful silence of my home. I was standing in the kitchen frying eggs and listening to the quiet crackle of the cast iron pan. I did not need to look out the front window to know exactly who had just arrived. The heavy, aggressive slamming of two car doors echoed through the morning air, followed instantly by the sound of heavy footsteps storming up my front porch. They did not bother to ring the doorbell or wait for an invitation. The heavy brass doorknob turned violently, and the front door was thrown open with such intense force that it slammed loudly against the interior hallway wall. Aaron and Melissa marched directly into my kitchen, bringing the cold, bitter air of their absolute panic right into my home. I slowly turned off the stove and wiped my hands on a cloth towel, completely ignoring their dramatic entrance. I took a moment to truly look at my son. The polished, arrogant medical visionary who wore custom-tailored white coats and drank complimentary champagne with local celebrities was completely gone. Aaron looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive designer shirt was wrinkled and completely untucked. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were wild with the terrifying exhaustion of a man who had clearly stayed awake all night watching his fake empire burn to the ground. Melissa stood right beside him, looking like a cornered wild animal. Her expensive makeup was heavily smudged, and the arrogant, condescending smirk she always wore around me was permanently erased from her face. She was clutching a leather designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were turning completely white. Aaron did not say good morning. He did not ask how I was doing. He immediately launched into a massive theatrical display of emotional manipulation. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperate panic. He demanded to know exactly what I had done to his medical practice. He yelled that his entire elite internet reputation was completely destroyed because the massive social media influencer had posted a viral video calling him a total fraud. He screamed that his clinic phone was ringing off the hook, with wealthy patients desperately trying to cancel their upcoming appointments because they no longer trusted him. He aggressively pointed his finger directly at my face and accused me of intentionally destroying his lifelong dream. He told me that I was a bitter, jealous old man who could not stand to see his own son achieve true modern success. He claimed that because I had spent my entire life working in the freezing dirt, pouring concrete for a living, I was secretly deeply resentful of his clean, prestigious medical career. I stood there in absolute silence and let him scream. I let him empty his pathetic lungs. When the accusations of jealousy did not provoke an emotional reaction from me, Aaron desperately reached for the ultimate weapon. He decided to use the memory of his dead mother to try and break my spirit. His voice dropped into a pathetic, theatrical whisper as he dramatically asked me what my beautiful late wife would think of me right now. He asked me how I could possibly look at myself in the mirror, knowing I was actively destroying the only child she had ever loved. He swore to me that if his mother were still alive today, she would be absolutely disgusted by my cruel, unforgiving behavior. He told me that she would have gladly given him the $150,000 Phase 2 capital without asking a single question, because she actually understood what unconditional family love meant. It was a beautifully constructed emotional trap perfectly designed to make a grieving father completely collapse with guilt and instantly open his wallet. A few months ago, those exact cruel words would have broken my heart into a million pieces. I would have desperately apologized and handed over my life savings just to stop him from looking at me with such intense hatred. But the father who blindly loved that boy had completely died the very moment Melissa told me I was not invited to the clinic grand opening. I looked at my son, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical pity. I saw him for exactly what he was. He was a weak, spoiled man desperately using a dead woman to try and secure a financial bailout. When my continued silence absolutely infuriated Aaron, Melissa decided it was time for her to take control of the situation. She aggressively stepped in front of her husband, completely dropping the emotional manipulation tactics and pulling out what she foolishly believed was a massive legal weapon. She puffed out her chest and tried to look incredibly intimidating. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at me and aggressively threatened to completely destroy me in a court of law. She screamed that she had already spoken to a brilliant team of corporate lawyers. That was a complete lie, of course. No reputable lawyer would ever take her case, but she believed the lie sounded terrifying. She confidently declared that she was filing a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit against me for severe tortious interference. She aggressively accused me of illegally contacting her private commercial lender and intentionally sabotaging her emergency bridge loan application. She screamed that I had absolutely no legal right to speak to the alternative lending group or discuss the private financial matters of her dermatology clinic. She claimed my actions were a highly illegal breach of corporate privacy and a direct malicious attack on her livelihood. She threatened to drag my name through the mud and take away my house, my truck, and my entire retirement fund to compensate her for the extreme emotional distress I had maliciously caused. Melissa truly believed she was delivering a brilliant legal checkmate. She actually thought that throwing around complex legal terms like tortious interference would completely terrify an uneducated blue-collar relic into immediate submission. She demanded that I instantly call the alternative lending group, apologize for my illegal interference, and formally release my senior secured lien on the clinic assets. She promised that if I completely signed over the business to her right now, she would be generous enough to drop the massive lawsuit and let me walk away quietly. I listened to her ridiculous, unhinged demands, and I almost laughed out loud at the sheer magnitude of her delusion. She was standing inside my house threatening to sue me for protecting my own money from her massive embezzlement scheme. She completely believed that because she possessed a loud voice and a designer handbag, she could successfully bully a man who had spent 40 years ruthlessly destroying aggressive commercial competitors. I looked back and forth between the two of them. I saw Aaron desperately clinging to his mother memory, and I saw Melissa desperately clinging to her fake legal threats. They were two drowning rats viciously attacking the only piece of floating wood left in the water, completely unaware that the wood was securely bolted to the bottom of the ocean. They finally stopped yelling. Their chests were heavily heaving as they desperately tried to catch their breath. The loud, chaotic echoes of their screaming slowly faded into the corners of my quiet kitchen. They stood there completely expecting me to finally break. They expected me to start crying, or yelling, or desperately begging for their forgiveness. They expected the familiar pathetic compliance they had completely trained me to provide. I calmly picked up my mug of black coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, bitter liquid tasted absolutely perfect. I looked directly into my son's eyes, and I saw the very first microscopic trace of genuine fear begin to form in his pupils. He suddenly realized that the old man standing in front of him was not reacting like a guilty father. I was reacting like a brick wall. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their chaotic panic. I simply asked them if they were completely finished throwing their little temper tantrum inside my kitchen. Melissa gasped in absolute shock, and her face turned a bright, furious shade of red. She aggressively opened her mouth to start screaming another barrage of fake legal threats, but I raised my calloused hand and completely silenced her. My voice was incredibly low and dangerously quiet, completely commanding the absolute authority of the room. I told her that she was not going to speak another word in my house. I told her that she was going to stand there and silently listen to exactly how the real world actually works. The ultimate confrontation had finally reached its absolute boiling point. They had fired every single emotional and legal bullet they had in their pathetic weapons, and they had completely missed the target. They were totally out of ammunition, and I was just getting started. I slowly turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen, heading directly toward my home office. I knew they would follow me because they had absolutely nowhere else to go. It was finally time to drop the massive concrete anvil directly onto their fragile glass castle. It was time to show them the folders. I walked out of the kitchen, and my heavy work boots made a slow, rhythmic sound against the hardwood floor. I knew they were following me. I could hear their frantic footsteps trailing right behind me. Aaron and Melissa were completely silent now. The sheer, unyielding confidence in my posture had successfully suffocated their chaotic yelling. I stepped into my home office, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. This was not a warm family living room. This was a room built for ruthless commercial warfare. The walls were lined with heavy wooden bookshelves holding decades of complex real estate ledgers and legal texts. The morning sun poured through the large window, casting a bright, unforgiving light directly onto my massive oak desk. I walked behind the desk and slowly sat down in my heavy leather chair. Aaron and Melissa stood awkwardly on the other side of the desk, looking like two guilty children called into the principal office. They completely expected me to start arguing with them. They were aggressively prepared for a loud, emotional shouting match where we would violently trade insults until someone finally apologized. I refused to give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Anger is a completely useless emotion that only clouds your judgment when you are executing a perfect legal kill. I rested my calloused hands flat against the polished wood of my desk. Sitting directly in front of me, perfectly aligned in a neat row, were 3 thick manila folders. I looked at my son. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed. He was nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot, completely terrified of the absolute silence in the room. I reached out and slowly opened the very first folder. I slid it across the smooth wooden surface until it rested perfectly in front of him. I told him to look closely at the document inside. I told him it was the exact same 80-page operating agreement he and his wife had so eagerly signed at my dining room table just a few months ago. Aaron looked down at the paper, and I saw his eyes desperately scanning the complex legal jargon. I calmly explained the brutal reality of his situation. I told him that he had spent his entire adult life believing he was a brilliant self-made medical visionary. He truly believed he owned a highly successful luxury dermatology practice. I shattered that beautiful illusion with a single sentence. I told him that the $900,000 I gave him was never a generous family gift. It was a comprehensive senior secured loan, and he did not actually own a single piece of his own business. I pointed to the specific paragraphs outlining the massive lien I held over his entire medical operation. I explained that every single patient file, every piece of waiting room furniture, and every drop of cosmetic chemicals legally belonged to me. I watched the color completely drain from his face as he finally realized the massive legal chain wrapped tightly around his neck. Then I delivered the first fatal blow. I directed his attention to the strict default clause buried deep inside the contract. I explained that the restricted capital was legally mandated to be used exclusively for the outright purchase of medical equipment to secure the loan collateral. I told him I knew exactly what he and his wife had done. I told him I knew they had maliciously leased the laser machines to artificially preserve the cash for their own luxury salaries. I explained that by intentionally leasing the equipment, they had completely violated the core financial covenant and triggered an immediate catastrophic default on the $900,000 loan. Aaron started to panic. He opened his mouth to formulate a desperate, pathetic excuse. He wanted to blame the supply chain or claim it was just a temporary business strategy. I raised my hand and completely silenced him. I told him I was not interested in his pathetic lies because the truth was sitting right in the second folder. I reached out and flipped open the second thick manila folder. I pushed the massive stack of forensic accounting documents across the desk, completely covering the legal contract. I looked directly at Melissa. She was staring at the accounting papers, and her entire body began to tremble uncontrollably. She recognized the official bank logos printed at the top of the pages. She knew exactly what I was showing them. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the quiet room like a razor blade. I told Aaron that his brilliant clinic administrator was not just incompetent. She was a calculated, ruthless criminal. I explained that my legal team had executed a comprehensive forensic audit of the primary clinic bank accounts. I told my son to look at the long list of massive wire transfers highlighted in bright yellow ink. I explained that for the past several months, Melissa had been aggressively siphoning the operational budget to a completely fake shadow corporation called Apex Lifestyle Management. Aaron looked completely horrified. He stared down at the highlighted numbers and then looked up at his wife. He asked her what Apex Lifestyle Management was, and his voice was completely trembling with fear. Melissa could not even look him in the eye. She stared down at the floor, completely paralyzed by the massive, undeniable proof of her absolute betrayal. I answered the question for him. I told Aaron that Apex Lifestyle Management was a fraudulent shell company completely owned and operated by his own wife. I explained that she had been billing his medical practice tens of thousands of dollars every single month for completely fabricated marketing and consulting services. I pulled out her personal bank statements and laid them flat on the desk for him to see. I showed him exactly where his clinic operating funds were actually going. I pointed to the massive down payment for her slate gray Porsche. I pointed to the thousands of dollars spent at high-end designer clothing boutiques and luxury weekend spa retreats. I explained that the reason his medical supply cabinets were completely empty yesterday was not because of a sudden, unexplainable banking error. It was because his wife was intentionally starving his medical practice to death just to fund her own endless vanity. She had completely ignored 2 months of critical vendor invoices, prioritizing her fake consulting fees over the basic sterile bandages he desperately needed to perform his job. I told him that the massive social media disaster he suffered yesterday was entirely orchestrated by the woman standing right next to him. The absolute unified front of their shared greed completely shattered right in front of my eyes. Aaron turned to Melissa, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He realized that she had intentionally destroyed his precious elite reputation just to buy expensive shoes and luxury cars. He started yelling at her, demanding to know how she could possibly do this to him. He called her a thief and a liar. He completely forgot about the massive lawsuit she had threatened me with just 10 minutes ago. He completely forgot about his dead mother. He only cared about the horrifying fact that his wife had completely bankrupted his professional future. Melissa tried to desperately defend herself. She started crying and stammering, claiming that she only took the money because she deserved a proper luxury lifestyle for managing such a stressful business. She tried to blame Aaron, saying he was always too busy playing doctor with local celebrities to ever look at the financial books. They began viciously tearing each other apart right inside my office. The stress of the trap was crushing them, and they were turning on each other like starved wolves. I let them scream at each other for a few moments, watching their toxic marriage completely disintegrate under the crushing weight of the truth. Then I picked up the third folder. The heavy sound of the thick manila folder hitting the wooden desk instantly silenced them. They both turned back to look at me, completely terrified of what final nightmare I was about to unleash. I opened the final folder and slowly slid the official commercial foreclosure notices across the desk. I told them that the forensic audit was just the beginning of their punishment. I explained that because they had intentionally triggered the massive default clause in the operating agreement, I had formally exercised my absolute legal right as the senior secured creditor. I pointed to the top document and explained the brutal reality of their current situation. I told them I had completely seized total legal ownership of the dermatology clinic. I told them that the business no longer belonged to them in any capacity. I owned the building lease, I owned the intellectual property, I owned the expensive Italian marble desk, and I owned every single future patient receivable. Melissa desperately tried to find a way out of the trap. She pointed her shaking finger at me and tearfully claimed that she was going to use the emergency bridge loan to pay off the medical supply vendor and save the clinic. She told me the loan was already in process and the money would be deposited by the end of the day. I smiled a very cold, entirely genuine smile. I told her that she was completely delusional. I informed her that the alternative lending group had officially permanently denied her fraudulent loan application yesterday afternoon. I explained that the underwriter called my legal team directly because I was registered as the senior lien holder on the state commercial registry. I told her I personally instructed my lawyer to inform the bank that she was attempting to illegally pledge leased medical equipment as commercial collateral. Melissa physically stumbled backward as if I had just punched her directly in the chest. She finally realized that the terrifying phone call she received from the loan underwriter yesterday was entirely orchestrated by me. She realized I had completely isolated them from every single financial resource in the entire city. Aaron looked completely defeated. His shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant fire was completely gone from his eyes. He asked me in a tiny, pathetic whisper what was going to happen next. He asked me how he was supposed to perform his scheduled cosmetic procedures today without any medical supplies or access to the clinic bank accounts. I looked at my son and delivered the final absolute consequence of his incredible arrogance. I told him that he was not going to perform any procedures today. I told him that he was never going to step foot inside that beautiful luxury clinic ever again. I explained that while they were busy driving over here to scream at me in my kitchen, my private legal team was currently standing at the clinic with local law enforcement officers. The locks on the heavy glass doors were being completely changed. A formal legal notice of commercial foreclosure was being taped directly to the front window for every single wealthy patient and local celebrity to see. I told them the game was completely over. The fake glamorous life they had built using my stolen retirement funds was officially permanently terminated. I told them they had exactly 10 minutes to pack their personal belongings and get out of my house before I called the police and had them formally arrested for trespassing and federal commercial fraud. I closed the 3 empty folders and completely ignored their desperate sobbing. The absolute dismantling was finished. I watched the heavy reality of the commercial foreclosure notices completely crush the last remaining ounce of their defiance. The beautiful glass castle they had built with my money was gone. The fake empire was completely dead. But the absolute worst part of their nightmare was not the loss of the luxury clinic. The worst part was the second folder sitting open on my desk. The comprehensive forensic accounting documents were the undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and severe embezzlement. Melissa stared at those bank statements with wide, terrified eyes. She knew exactly what happens to people who steal secured corporate funds and forge legal documents to secure predatory loans. She was looking at a massive federal prison sentence. In that terrifying moment of absolute self-preservation, the shallow vows of her marriage completely evaporated into thin air. She did not turn to her husband for comfort or support. She turned on him like a cornered snake completely desperate to survive. Melissa pointed a shaking finger directly at Aaron, and her voice became high and shrill with absolute panic. She looked at me and frantically claimed that Aaron knew absolutely everything about the shadow consulting company. She swore to me that he had given her complete verbal authorization to set up the fraudulent entity. She claimed that he was the one who told her to lease the expensive medical equipment because he wanted to keep the cash reserves extremely high to fund their lavish personal lifestyle. She was lying through her teeth, of course. She was desperately trying to distribute the massive criminal liability. If she was going to drown, she was completely determined to drag her husband down into the dark water right alongside her. She yelled that Aaron was the registered medical director and the primary owner on the corporate paperwork, so he was legally responsible for every single financial decision she made. She told me that Aaron was just playing stupid, and that he happily enjoyed driving the luxury sports car and taking the expensive vacations she paid for with the stolen money. She tried to paint him as the criminal mastermind, while claiming she was just a devoted wife following his direct orders. Aaron looked at his wife as if she had just physically stabbed him directly in the chest. The golden boy of the elite medical world, the arrogant dermatologist who truly thought he was completely untouchable, suddenly realized that his own wife was actively framing him for a massive federal crime. His face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute hatred. The shock quickly mutated into a violent, explosive rage. He stepped aggressively toward her, completely invading her personal space. He yelled that she was a toxic, delusional parasite. He screamed that he never authorized a single penny to go to her fake consulting firm. He reminded her that he was the one actually working grueling 14-hour days, dealing with the demanding patients, and building the medical brand while she sat in her imported marble office shopping for designer clothes online. He called her completely useless. He said she brought absolutely nothing of value to the business or to his life. He screamed that he only let her pretend to be the clinic administrator because she constantly complained about being bored at home and he was tired of listening to her whine. He told her she was nothing but a glorified receptionist who had completely destroyed his entire future out of pure selfish vanity. The words he used were incredibly cruel and deeply personal. The thin, polished veneer of their upper-class marriage was entirely stripped away, leaving only the ugly, rotting foundation of mutual opportunism. They did not actually love each other. They only loved the money and the elite social status that the money provided. Now that the money was completely gone, the status was permanently destroyed, and the police were actively changing the locks on their building, there was absolutely nothing left to hold them together. Melissa aggressively pushed him away and screamed right back in his face. She completely dropped the innocent wife act and viciously mocked his elite medical reputation. She told him he was a pathetic fake doctor who only cared about getting invited to wealthy parties and taking pictures with social media influencers. She laughed a harsh, hysterical laugh and told him that none of those wealthy socialites actually respected him at all. She said they only used him for free cosmetic laser treatments and constantly laughed at him behind his back. She screamed that he was a weak, spineless man who had to run to his elderly father for capital because he was too incompetent to secure a real commercial loan on his own merits. Aaron raised his hands and grabbed his own hair in absolute frustration. He looked like a man who was completely losing his mind. He yelled that he was going to hire his own aggressive criminal defense attorney the very second he left my house. He told her he was going to hand over every single personal email, every text message, and every financial password to the federal investigators to prove that she acted completely alone. He swore to her that he would gladly testify against her in open federal court and happily watch her go to prison just to save his own medical license. She laughed right in his face and told him he was incredibly stupid for thinking he could escape the damage. She reminded him that the predatory loan application she submitted yesterday, the one that was permanently flagged for severe commercial fraud, contained his forged digital signature. She told him the federal financial investigators would see his name stamped right on the fraudulent application, and they would never believe he was an innocent victim. She told him that because they were legally married, the authorities would completely freeze all of their shared assets, including his personal bank accounts and the luxury townhouse they lived in. She smiled a vicious, cruel smile and told him they were both going down together and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. I sat quietly in my heavy leather chair and watched the spectacular, violent implosion of their shared life. I did not interrupt them. I did not try to calm them down or offer any parental guidance. I simply folded my calloused hands on the desk and observed the chaotic destruction. This was the true cost of unearned comfort. This was the absolute consequence of treating people like disposable resources. When you build a relationship entirely on a foundation of greed and vanity, the slightest pressure will cause the entire structure to violently collapse and completely crush everyone trapped inside. I thought about my late wife and the beautiful, strong marriage we had built over 40 years. We built our life on mutual respect, deep loyalty, and quiet sacrifice. We survived financial hardships and terrible storms because we actually valued each other more than the money. Looking at my son and his wife, I realized they had absolutely no idea what true loyalty even looked like. They completely forgot that I was even in the room. They paced back and forth across my home office, screaming terrible, vicious accusations at each other. They verbally tore each other to pieces, leaving absolutely nothing sacred untouched. I looked at the heavy brass clock sitting on my desk. The smooth second hand steadily swept across the face. The 10 minutes I had generously given them were almost completely gone. I slowly stood up from my chair. The simple movement caught their attention, and their chaotic screaming abruptly stopped. They turned to look at me completely out of breath, their faces flushed with extreme anger and pure terror. The heavy silence rushed back into the room, settling over us like a thick, dark blanket. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, steady rhythm of a man who was completely finished with a long, tedious job. I told them that their 10 minutes were officially up. I pointed toward the hallway leading to the front door. I told them to get out of my house immediately. I told them to take their toxic, pathetic drama out of my home and deal with the horrific criminal consequences of their actions on their own time. Aaron looked at me and his eyes suddenly filled with desperate, pathetic tears. He took a small, tentative step toward my desk. He opened his mouth to try and beg one last time, to try and appeal to the Father who used to love him unconditionally. He desperately wanted me to save him from his wife, from the federal investigators, and from the absolute ruin he was currently facing. He wanted me to make the nightmare go away, just like I had always done when he was a child. I stared right through him, completely unmoved by his tears. I told him that the protective father he was looking for was completely dead. I told him that he and his wife had killed that man the very day they decided my lifelong sacrifice was nothing more than a convenient automated teller machine to fund their fake reality. I told him I was just the senior secured creditor now, and the secured creditor does not offer emotional support or financial bailouts. I picked up my cell phone from the desk and held it firmly in my hand. I calmly informed them that if they did not turn around and walk out the front door right this exact second, I would dial the police and have them forcefully removed for trespassing. The absolute cold finality in my voice completely broke whatever remaining resistance they had left. Aaron slowly lowered his head. He looked completely hollow, entirely drained of his massive ego and his fake prestige. He turned around and walked slowly out of the office, his heavy footsteps echoing down the long hallway. He did not wait for his wife. He did not hold the door for her. He abandoned her just as quickly as she had betrayed him. Melissa stood there for a few seconds longer, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest. She looked down at the 3 folders sitting on my desk, the physical manifestation of her complete destruction. She finally realized that her arrogant assumption of my weakness was the most expensive mistake she would ever make in her entire life. She turned around and practically ran down the hallway, desperate to escape the crushing weight of her own failure. I stood alone in my quiet office and listened to the heavy front door slam shut. I listened to the separate sounds of their luxury cars violently starting in my driveway. They sped off in completely different directions, leaving behind a trail of dust and shattered illusions. The unified front of the thieves was permanently fractured. They had arrived at my home together, completely convinced they could easily bully an old man into submission. They left completely alone, absolutely terrified, and fully aware that their privileged lives were completely over. The trap had executed perfectly, and the absolute justice I sought was finally complete. I did not stay inside my quiet home after they drove away in their separate vehicles. I walked out to my old pickup truck and drove straight to the upscale medical district. I needed to witness the absolute finality of my legal strategy executing in the real world. By the time I pulled up to the sleek glass building, the gears of justice were already grinding their fake empire into dust. Simon had coordinated the commercial seizure perfectly. A team of private security contractors and 2 uniformed sheriff deputies were already standing inside the beautiful lobby. A professional commercial locksmith was actively drilling out the heavy brass deadbolts on the front glass doors. There were several wealthy clients standing outside on the pristine sidewalk, completely confused by the chaotic scene. They were holding their expensive designer handbags and looking through the large windows at the uniformed officers standing next to the imported Italian marble desk. These were the exact elite socialites my son had desperately tried to impress by giving away free cosmetic procedures. Now they were watching his luxury medical practice being actively raided by law enforcement. Aaron and Melissa arrived at the clinic just minutes after I did. Their 2 expensive luxury cars screeched into the premium parking spots near the back entrance. They practically sprinted toward the building, completely desperate to somehow stop the inevitable collapse they had just learned about in my kitchen. But the heavy glass doors were already locked from the inside by the private security team. Aaron pounded his fists against the thick glass, completely abandoning his polished, professional demeanor. He saw his wealthy clients staring at him from the sidewalk, and his face flushed with intense humiliation. He desperately tried to put on his charming medical visionary smile, but he was sweating profusely, and his expensive designer shirt was still completely wrinkled from our intense confrontation. He loudly shouted through the glass, trying to tell his patients that it was just a minor administrative error and that his clinic would be fully operational in a few short hours. I instructed the head security guard to open the door just enough to let my son and his wife step inside the lobby. I wanted this absolute dismantling to happen exactly where they had built their massive lies. Aaron stumbled into the room immediately, trying to take control of the narrative. He pointed at the uniformed deputies and aggressively demanded that they leave his private property. Simon stepped forward from the shadows, holding the thick stack of official court-ordered foreclosure documents. He did not speak quietly. Simon has a voice perfectly trained for a loud courtroom, and he utilized it flawlessly. He announced to the entire room, including the wealthy clients who were peering through the open doorway, that the dermatology practice was officially legally seized. He stated clearly that the seizure was due to severe commercial fraud and a complete default on a senior secured loan. The wealthy clients outside gasped in unison. The carefully crafted illusion of extreme wealth and medical prestige was completely publicly shattered in a matter of seconds. The clients immediately pulled out their cell phones and began typing furiously, undoubtedly spreading the incredible scandal to every single country club and elite social circle in the entire city. Melissa completely panicked. She suddenly realized that if the clinic was entirely seized, the federal financial investigators would soon be tearing through her private administrative office. She knew her computer hard drive contained all the fraudulent invoices and the digital banking transfers she had used to embezzle my money. She desperately tried to dart past the private security guards and sprint down the pristine white hallway toward her office. She screamed that she needed to collect her private medical records and her personal belongings before anyone else touched her desk. A large uniformed security guard stepped effortlessly into her path and firmly blocked the hallway. Simon looked at her with absolute disgust and calmly delivered the brutal legal reality. He informed her that every single item inside the entire building completely belonged to the private holding company. He told her the commercial lien covered her computer, her physical filing cabinets, and the imported marble desk she used to hide her crimes. He clearly warned her that if she attempted to touch a single piece of corporate property, she would be immediately arrested for evidence tampering and federal theft. Melissa physically recoiled as if Simon had struck her. She looked around the lavish waiting room she had personally designed and realized she was a complete stranger in a building she used to rule. Aaron slowly turned to look at me. I was standing near the back wall watching the entire pathetic scene unfold with absolute cold detachment. He walked slowly toward me, his eyes completely begging for a final shred of parental mercy. He lowered his voice to a pathetic whisper and asked me how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He told me I was completely humiliating him in front of the most important people in the entire city and destroying his only chance at a successful life. I looked at my son and felt absolutely no pity. I replied that I was not the one who humiliated him. I told him he had completely humiliated himself the very moment he decided to fund his arrogant vanity with stolen money. I reminded him that he was the one who handed his financial future over to a greedy parasite because he was too obsessed with taking pictures with internet influencers to actually run a profitable business. I told him the destruction of his dream was entirely his own fault, and I was simply the man collecting the overdue bill. The commercial locksmith finished installing the heavy new deadbolts on the front entrance. The uniformed deputies formally instructed the remaining patients on the sidewalk that all future medical appointments were permanently canceled and they should seek treatment elsewhere. The wealthy socialites quickly walked away to their expensive cars, shaking their heads and whispering about the absolute disgrace of the Gallagher family clinic. Aaron's professional reputation was completely bleeding out right there on the pristine white floor, and there was absolutely no medical procedure in the world that could ever fix it. Simon reached behind the marble reception desk and pulled out 2 small, empty cardboard boxes. He walked over and handed one box to Aaron and one box to Melissa. He told them they were legally permitted to take only their personal car keys, their cell phones, and the coats currently on their backs. He strictly informed them that absolutely nothing else was permitted to leave the premises. Melissa desperately tried to grab a small, expensive, decorative vase from the lobby side table, claiming it was a personal wedding gift. The security guard immediately stepped forward and firmly took the vase right out of her trembling hands, placing it safely behind the desk. She was not allowed to take a single penny of my investment out of that building. Then began the final walk of absolute shame. The two uniformed sheriff deputies flanked my son and his wife and firmly instructed them to walk toward the exit. Aaron and Melissa slowly walked out of the beautiful glass doors holding absolutely nothing but two empty cardboard boxes. The heavy mechanical sound of the new deadbolts clicking firmly into place echoed loudly through the quiet street. They were officially locked out of their own fake reality forever. They stood on the cold concrete sidewalk, completely isolated from the luxurious world they had stolen. They had no medical clinic, they had no operating capital, and they were entirely facing massive federal criminal charges for their extensive commercial fraud. They did not speak to each other. They just walked slowly toward their expensive leased cars, completely broken by the crushing weight of their own monumental greed. I stood inside the quiet lobby and looked around at the empire I had just legally conquered. The air conditioning hummed softly, pushing the scent of eucalyptus through the empty waiting room. The clinic was completely silent, but it finally felt clean. The toxic parasites had been forcefully removed, and the host was completely cured. The legal checkmate was flawlessly executed, and my retirement funds were officially safe. I walked over to the complimentary champagne bar, poured myself a small glass of sparkling water, and raised it toward the empty room. The lesson was completely delivered, and the absolute truth had finally won. The weeks following the commercial seizure were a masterclass in the absolute brutal efficiency of the legal system. I did not need to speak to my son or his wife to know exactly how their lives were unraveling. Simon provided me with regular detailed updates from the ongoing federal financial investigation and the civil bankruptcy proceedings. The absolute destruction of their fake empire was completely methodical and beautifully permanent. Aaron quickly discovered that the elite medical community he had so desperately tried to court was completely unforgiving. The viral video from the humiliated internet influencer had permanently stained his professional name. No private luxury practice in the city would even consider hiring him. The wealthy socialites who used to drink his complimentary champagne now openly mocked him at their exclusive country clubs. His reputation was toxic, and his professional network completely abandoned him the very moment he lost his expensive imported marble waiting room. But the most terrifying reality Aaron had to face was the massive mountain of debt slowly crushing him. Although I had legally seized the clinic assets, the commercial equipment, and the plush velvet furniture did not completely cover the massive remaining balance of the $900,000 loan. Furthermore, the federal authorities heavily fined him for his gross negligence regarding the leased medical lasers. The medical board threatened to completely revoke his license if he filed for personal bankruptcy to escape his federal fines. To avoid total destruction and keep his medical license, Aaron was forced to accept the only employment available to a disgraced doctor. He was forced to take a grueling entry-level position at a severely underfunded public health clinic on the far south side of the city. The contrast between his fake luxury past and his harsh new reality was absolutely staggering. He traded his custom-tailored white coat for a cheap paper gown. He no longer spent his afternoons performing expensive cosmetic laser treatments on local celebrities while smelling expensive eucalyptus diffusers. Instead, he spent 14 hours a day standing under buzzing fluorescent lights, smelling strong, cheap bleach, and treating severe skin infections. He spent his days draining painful abscesses and working in a chaotic, overcrowded waiting room filled with exhausted people who could not afford to pay him in cash. He was paid a tiny fraction of his former salary. He worked grueling double shifts just to keep up with the aggressive minimum payments the court ordered him to make to my holding company. Simon told me that Aaron looked completely exhausted walking out of the clinic at midnight, his shoulders heavy with the absolute crushing weight of actual honest labor. He was finally learning the exact same brutal lesson I learned 40 years ago pouring wet concrete in the freezing rain. He learned that respect is earned through sweat and sacrifice, not bought with stolen retirement funds. While Aaron was busy learning the true meaning of hard work, Melissa was experiencing a completely different kind of nightmare. Her extravagant lifestyle evaporated into thin air almost overnight. The federal investigators immediately froze all of her personal bank accounts, suspecting that the funds were entirely the product of her massive embezzlement scheme. The luxury slate gray Porsche was quickly repossessed by the dealership right out of her driveway because she completely missed 3 consecutive monthly payments. She was forced to trade her expensive designer heels for cheap walking shoes just to take the public bus across town. The lavish weekend spa retreats and the imported jewelry were permanently gone, replaced by the terrifying reality of unpaid utility bills and endless calls from aggressive debt collectors. Melissa possessed absolutely no actual marketable skills. Her fake consulting company was completely dissolved by the state, and her resume was nothing but a string of fabricated administrative titles. Every single time she applied for a simple office job, the hiring manager would run a standard background check and immediately discover the pending federal financial fraud investigation. Nobody wanted to hire a woman who had actively embezzled tens of thousands of dollars from her own family. She quickly realized that the glamorous life she felt so incredibly entitled to was never coming back. Because she was a creature built entirely on greed and self-preservation, she decided to completely abandon the sinking ship. She refused to lower her standard of living to support a disgraced public clinic doctor. Just 3 months after the clinic was seized, she formally filed for divorce. She hired a cheap, desperate divorce attorney, completely expecting to extract a massive financial settlement from Aaron. She truly believed she could legally secure half of whatever remaining assets he possessed and demand permanent alimony based on his future earnings as a medical professional. She marched into the small, cramped divorce mediation room, wearing the last clean designer outfit she owned, completely expecting to walk away a wealthy victim. She sat across from my son, with her chin held high, still foolishly believing she was the smartest person in the room. She had entirely forgotten about a quiet dinner we had exactly 5 years ago, right before their wedding. During that dinner, I explicitly told Aaron that I would not pay for his expensive medical school tuition unless he secured his future assets with an ironclad prenuptial agreement. I had Simon personally draft the legal document. It was a ruthless, comprehensive contract specifically designed to protect my financial investments from any potential future spouses. Melissa had eagerly signed that prenuptial agreement 5 years ago because Aaron had promised her a lifetime of endless wealth, and she simply did not care about the boring legal details at the time. As she sat in the divorce mediation room confidently demanding spousal support, Aaron silently pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase. He was completely exhausted, and his eyes carried the dark, heavy bags of a man who worked 14-hour shifts, but he still managed to find the strength to deliver the final blow. He silently slid the original signed prenuptial agreement across the table. The cheap divorce attorney picked up the document and quickly read through the clauses. The color completely drained from the attorney's face. He turned to Melissa and immediately told her the horrifying truth. The contract explicitly stated that in the event of a divorce caused by financial fraud, criminal negligence, or gross financial mismanagement, she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. The prenuptial agreement specifically protected all business assets, all future medical earnings, and all personal property from being divided. Melissa started screaming at her attorney, demanding that he fight the contract in court. The attorney calmly packed his briefcase and told her that the document was completely bulletproof. He told her that because she was currently under federal investigation for embezzling funds from the marital business, no judge in the entire country would ever invalidate the agreement to give her a massive payout. He told her she was completely wasting his time, and he walked right out of the room. She was left sitting at the table completely alone. She would receive no alimony. She would receive no portion of his meager public health salary. She was legally stripped of everything she had ever touched. She walked out of that mediation room completely empty-handed, stepping out into the cold city street with no money, no car, no husband, and absolutely no future. The arrogant woman who had openly mocked my worn-out clothes and proudly excluded me from her grand opening, was now completely ruined. The justice I demanded was not just loud, it was incredibly precise. Her complete and absolute destruction was finally achieved, leaving her to fade away into the exact same shadows she had once tried to force me into. With the toxic parasites permanently removed from the host, my beautiful glass building sat completely empty for exactly 2 months. The heavy new deadbolts kept the expensive imported Italian marble and the high-tech medical lasers safely locked away in the dark. A weaker man might have simply sold the entire property at a massive loss just to completely wash his hands of the painful family tragedy. But I am not a weak man, and I am certainly not a man who accepts a financial loss. I am a commercial real estate developer. When a building catches fire, you do not abandon the land. You clear away the blackened rubble, you pour a fresh concrete foundation, and you build something much stronger in its place. I had a fully furnished, state-of-the-art luxury medical facility, completely wired and ready for immediate operation. I owned the building lease, I owned the expensive velvet furniture, and because I had legally absorbed the vendor debt, I owned every single piece of advanced surgical machinery inside those walls. I simply needed to find the right people to turn my dead asset into a highly performing investment. I called Simon and gave him very specific instructions for the new tenant search. I told him I did not want any arrogant established doctors who cared more about their social status than their actual patients. I wanted the exact opposite of my son. I wanted young, hungry first-generation medical professionals. I wanted doctors who actually understood the crushing weight of student debt and knew the absolute value of a hard-earned dollar. Within 3 weeks, Simon found exactly what I was looking for. He introduced me to a group of 3 young, brilliant dermatologists. They had all graduated at the absolute top of their medical school classes, but they were completely buried under hundreds of thousands of dollars in unforgiving student loans. They were currently working exhausting, grueling shifts at a massive, faceless corporate hospital because they simply did not have the massive capital required to open their own private practice. They could not afford to buy expensive medical lasers or lease premium commercial space in the elite medical district. I arranged to meet them at the empty clinic on a bright Tuesday morning. When I unlocked the heavy glass doors and turned on the bright lights, they walked into the pristine lobby with absolute awe. They ran their hands over the Italian marble reception desk and looked at the expensive eucalyptus diffusers, completely terrified to even touch anything. When I showed them the private procedure rooms fully equipped with the absolute latest medical technology, they looked like starving people who had just been invited to a massive royal banquet. We sat down in the beautiful administrative office, the exact same room where Melissa had desperately tried to threaten me with fake lawsuits. The 3 young doctors sat nervously across from me, completely expecting me to demand a predatory financial arrangement. They knew they had zero leverage, and they were absolutely desperate for this rare opportunity. I did not take advantage of their desperation. I placed a standard fair commercial lease agreement on the marble desk. I offered them a complete turnkey operation. They could immediately take over the fully furnished luxury clinic and utilize every single piece of advanced medical equipment to treat their own patients. In exchange, they would pay me a strict, flat, monthly commercial rent. I did not ask for a percentage of their future medical profits, and I did not demand any administrative control over their daily business operations. I simply wanted a reliable, guaranteed return on my original investment. The young doctors read the contract, and they were completely overwhelmed with genuine gratitude. They did not roll their eyes at the legal paperwork. They did not ask for expensive luxury cars or complimentary champagne bars. They eagerly signed the commercial lease and shook my calloused hand with deep, profound respect. They looked at me not as an irrelevant old man, but as the generous, silent partner who had just handed them the absolute keys to their professional future. They gave me the exact, genuine respect my own flesh and blood had entirely refused to provide. Just 2 months later, the luxury clinic was completely reborn. It was no longer a shallow vanity project, designed to impress internet influencers and wealthy socialites. It was a highly profitable, incredibly efficient medical business run by 3 dedicated professionals who actually cared about healing their patients. They changed the registered name of the practice, they completely removed the ridiculous champagne bar, and they treated the expensive medical equipment with the utmost care. They worked long, honest hours, and they built a pristine reputation based on actual medical talent rather than fake social media marketing. I sit in my quiet home office on the first day of every single month, and I open my laptop. I do not have to chase down late payments or listen to arrogant excuses about delayed wire transfers. I simply watch the massive rent check automatically clear my primary bank account. That monthly rent completely replaces the retirement funds my son and his wife attempted to steal from me. My financial future is absolutely secured, and the heavy burden of trying to buy family loyalty is permanently lifted from my shoulders. The sun shines brightly through my office window, warming the heavy oak desk where this entire war began. I do not feel any lingering anger toward Aaron or Melissa. I do not wonder what they are doing or where they are currently living. They simply do not exist in my world anymore. I reach out and pick up my warm mug of black coffee, taking a slow, deep sip. The house is completely quiet, but it is no longer a lonely, deafening silence. It is the peaceful, satisfying hum of a perfectly oiled machine executing its intended purpose. The massive ledger is finally completely balanced. The brutal lesson was permanently delivered, and the absolute truth remains standing. Did you enjoy the final conclusion of my story? Please let me know what you thought about the brutal legal trap I used to protect my life savings. Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about justice and survival. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next life story.